Ravenna moved through the undergrowth with a silence that was unnatural, a ghost in the twilight. Her every sense was honed, not by the gifts of a wolf she did not possess, but by the harsh lessons of survival and 5 years of rage-fueled training that had transformed her body into a weapon. The snap of a twig 100 yards to her left was not a squirrel. Its weight was too heavy, its rhythm too deliberate. The faint, acrid smell of stale sweat and fear on the wind was not an animal. It belonged to a man, a wolf who had forgotten the laws of his own kind. She was closing in. Her target was an alpha named Gregor, a brute who had deserted his post and carved a bloody path through 3 farming villages, taking what he wanted and leaving ruin in his wake. The royal court wanted him brought to justice. Ravenna wanted him neutralized. They were, for now, the same thing. She drew a long, steadying breath, the cool air doing little to soothe the familiar heat building behind her ribs. Not panic, not fear. The cold fire that had kept her breathing through 5 years of hell, this was her life now. The hunt, the capture, the quiet, controlled satisfaction of seeing another monster caged. It was a hollow victory always, but it was the only one she knew. She crested a small ridge, dropping flat to the ground behind a rotted log. Below, in a small clearing, Gregor was hunched over a meager fire, gnawing on a poorly cooked rabbit. He looked less like a fearsome rogue and more like a cornered animal, his eyes darting nervously into the shadows. They always got sloppy when they were scared. He thought he was the predator, but he had been her prey for 3 days straight. 3 days of methodical poisoning. She'd laced his water source with trace amounts of wolfsbane, not enough to alert him, just enough to slow his reflexes, dull the edge of his shift. It was what the monks had taught her. Wolves fight with instinct. Instinct can be predicted. But a human with patience and poison? That was unpredictable. She uncoiled the silver-laced rope from her belt, its metallic sheen dull in the fading light. Silver was a painful deterrent to a wolf, especially one whose system was already compromised. It was the cold steel of the shackles she carried that truly ended a fight. Ravenna didn't engage in brawls. She didn't rely on brute strength she didn't possess. She was a creature of strategy, leverage, and channeled fury. She waited, her patience a vast, empty ocean. She could wait for hours, for days if needed. The stillness was her shield, the silence her weapon. When Gregor finally stood, stretching his thick arms and turning his back to her ridge to relieve himself against a tree, she fed every memory, every blow, every moment she'd been helpless, into the flames of her focus. The rope left her hand before he could finish. This wasn't just strategy. This was wrath given form. He didn't have time to scream, let alone shift. The weighted end of her rope whipped through the air, wrapping twice around his throat with a vicious snap. He clawed at the silver, a choked gasp escaping his lips as it burned his skin. But the wolfsbane in his system made his movement sluggish, his shift slow to respond. Ravenna didn't pause. She used his panicked stumble to her advantage, planting her boot behind his knee and shoving. The large alpha crashed to the ground, his head hitting the dirt with a dull thud. Before he could recover, she was on him, a knee planted firmly in the center of his back, her hands efficiently binding his wrists with the steel shackles. 30 seconds. That's how long it took rage to defeat arrogance. Afterward, her hands shook slightly, not from fear, from the effort of not killing him. That was the hard part. The monks had taught her to kill. She'd had to teach herself restraint. Gregor, the terror of the northern farmlands, lay gasping and subdued at her feet. He twisted his head, his eyes wide with disbelief and fury. An omega? He spat, the word a curse. They sent a wolfless omega to hunt me? Ravenna looked down at him, her gray eyes as flat and lifeless as a winter sky. She felt the rage coiled beneath her ribs, a living thing demanding release. But she kept her voice low and even. They sent an enforcer. Your rank is irrelevant. Your crimes are not. She hauled him to his feet, ignoring his sputtering protests and threats. The journey back to the outpost would be long, and he would be a difficult burden, but she was used to carrying heavy loads. It was what she did. She survived. She endured. She delivered justice with the same cold, precise fury she applied to every aspect of her life. It was the only way to keep the screaming ghosts of her own past locked away in the cage she'd built around her heart. 2 days later, cleaned and clad in her simple but severe black leather uniform, she stood before the towering doors of the Alpha King's throne room. A summons had been waiting for her at the outpost. It was unusual. Typically, she delivered her bounties to the local beta and received her next assignment via courier. A direct summons from Alpha King Kalen Voss himself was unheard of, especially for a contractor of her station. The guards, massive wolves in gleaming silver armor, looked down their noses at her. They smelled her rank, Omega, and their disdain was palpable. She met their gazes without flinching, her own expression unreadable. She had faced down far worse than condescending guards. The great doors groaned open, and she stepped inside. The throne room was vast, designed to intimidate, with soaring ceilings and banners depicting the long, victorious history of the Voss lineage. At the far end, on a throne carved from ancient petrified wood, sat the king. Kalen was everything an Alpha King was supposed to be. Imposing, powerful, with an aura of command that pressed down on the very air. His dark hair was a stark contrast to the silver circlet on his brow, and his eyes, the color of molten gold, missed nothing. He was watching her approach, his expression unreadable. For the first time in a long time, Ravenna felt a flicker of something other than cold control. It was not fear, precisely. It was a reluctant, instinctual awareness of the sheer, overwhelming power radiating from the male on the throne. He was the apex predator, the alpha of alphas, and every broken piece of her Omega past screamed at her to bow her head, to make herself small. She forced her chin up and met his gaze head-on. She would not be small. Not anymore. Kalen Voss watched the woman approach, and for the first time in his 10 years as king, he was genuinely intrigued. On paper, she was an anomaly. Ravenna Ashford, an Omega, wolfless according to every report, yet she was the single most effective rogue hunter in his employ. She had a 100% capture rate, a feat unmatched even by his elite Royal Guard units. Her reports were stark, concise, and devoid of any emotion. They detailed the crime, the hunt, and the capture. Nothing more. He had expected someone hard-bitten, perhaps with the brutish muscle of a seasoned warrior. Instead, the woman who walked the long aisle toward his throne was slender, her movements fluid and economical. She wore no armor, only fitted black leathers that were practical, not decorative. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe braid, and her face, pale and unadorned, was a mask of neutrality. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the gray of a storm-tossed sea, and they held no deference, no fear, and no warmth. They simply were. As she drew closer, his wolf stirred. It was a strange, unfamiliar sensation, a low, thrumming hum in his chest, a sudden sharpening of his senses. The scent of the throne room, of old stone, beeswax, and the cloying perfumes of the courtiers who had been dismissed just moments before, faded into the background. All he could smell was her. Rain-soaked earth, wild herbs, and something else, something hidden deep beneath the surface, like crushed lavender and steel forged in fire, and the faintest echo of a wolf that should be there but wasn't. Not gone, but sleeping, suppressed beneath layers of trauma and survival. It was a scent that spoke of resilience and controlled fury, and it called to a part of him he had long thought dormant. His wolf, the powerful beast that had held the crown for a decade, sat up and took notice. It did not growl with dominance, as it did with all others. It whined, a soft, questioning sound in the back of his mind, reaching for something in her that reached back, even though she didn't know it yet. Mate? The thought was so foreign, so unexpected, that he almost dismissed it. He had spent years searching for his fated mate, attending endless balls and diplomatic meetings, hoping for the spark of recognition the elders spoke of. He had found nothing. The idea that his mate would be this cold, wolfless Omega who hunted his enemies for coin was improbable. And yet, the pull was undeniable, and his wolf insisted. Her inner wolf was there, dormant and wounded, but present, and it recognized him even if her human consciousness didn't yet. Ravenna stopped 10 paces from the dais, a respectful but not subservient distance. She did not bow or scrape. She simply inclined her head in a short, sharp nod. "Your Majesty, you summoned me." Her voice was like her eyes, a low, even gray, no inflection, no emotion. Kalen leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, studying her. He had to force his own voice to remain steady, to betray none of the sudden turmoil in his mind. "Enforcer Ashford, I have been reviewing your service records. They are exemplary." "I am effective," she stated, not as a boast, but as a simple fact. "Indeed, you captured Gregor Macklin. My northern beta and his entire unit tracked him for a month with no success. You found him in 3 days. Alone." "He was predictable," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "Most arrogant alphas are, and wolfsbane makes them slower." A flicker of amusement touched Kalen's lips. "You poisoned him. It wasn't a question." "I don't fight like a wolf, Your Majesty. I fight like something wolves underestimate." "And you are not intimidated by arrogant alphas." Ravenna's expression didn't change, but he saw a subtle tightening around her eyes, a fleeting shadow that was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Intimidation is a tool. It is only effective if you allow it to be." Kalen felt a surge of respect for her. This was no ordinary Omega. The trauma he could sense coiled deep inside her had not broken her. It had forged her into something sharp and unyielding. He had summoned her here with a purpose, an offer he'd been considering for weeks. Now, with the insistent thrum of his wolf's recognition echoing in his chest, that purpose felt more like fate. "I am dissolving your independent contract," he said, watching for her reaction. There was none. Her face remained a perfect, still mask. "I am offering you a permanent position, at my side, as my personal enforcer. The King's Hand, with all the authority the title implies." A ripple of shock went through the 2 royal guards flanking his throne. He heard one of them take a sharp, incredulous breath. The King's Hand was a title that had been empty for 50 years, a position of immense power, second only to the king himself. To offer it to anyone was shocking. To offer it to a wolfless Omega was heresy. Ravenna's composure finally cracked, but only just. A slight widening of her eyes, a fractional parting of her lips. She recovered in an instant. "Why?" she asked, the single word sharp and direct. "Because I require someone with your skills. Someone who operates outside the conventional pack hierarchy. Someone whose loyalty is to justice, not to ambition. You have proven you possess a unique and valuable talent for seeing through the deceptions of powerful wolves. I want that talent here, in my court, where the deceptions are most potent." It was the truth, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that his wolf was demanding it, that the scent of her was already something he didn't want to let go of, that he needed to have this fascinating, broken, powerful woman near him. He needed to understand her. He needed to protect her, though from what, he wasn't yet sure. Ravenna was silent for a long moment, her gaze searching his. He let her look, keeping his own expression open, allowing her to see the sincerity in his offer. He could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, the weighing of risk versus reward. To be the King's Hand would grant her unprecedented authority and security, but it would also place her in the center of the viper's nest that was his court. For a woman who so clearly valued her solitude and control, it was a dangerous proposition. "My authority would be absolute?" she asked, her voice still quiet but with a new undercurrent of steel. "Answerable only to me?" "Only to me," he confirmed, "and you would have my full protection. No one," He let his gaze flicker to his guards, his alpha command bleeding into his voice, making the air crackle. "We'll question your position." The guards flinched and lowered their eyes. Ravenna did not. She simply watched him, her head tilted slightly. Finally, she gave another one of her sharp, decisive nods. "I accept." A wave of profound relief washed over Kalen, so potent it almost buckled him. His wolf settled, purring with a satisfaction that was both possessive and deeply comforting. "Mine." "Good," he said, his voice deeper than intended. "You will be quartered in the royal wing. We begin at dawn." She nodded again, turned, and walked away, her back straight, her steps as silent and deliberate as they had been on her approach. Kalen watched her go, the scent of rain and lavender and steel lingering in the air long after she had disappeared. He had just tied himself to a storm, and he had never felt more alive. The royal wing was a gilded cage. Ravenna's quarters were larger than any dwelling she had ever known, with a soft bed, a private bathing chamber, and a balcony overlooking the royal gardens. It was opulent, quiet, and utterly suffocating. For the first week, she barely slept. The silence was too deep, the comfort too foreign. She was used to the hard ground, the whisper of the wind her only lullaby, the constant threat of danger her only companion. Here, the softness felt like a trap. Her duties as the king's hand were, at first, deceptively simple. She stood at the right side of his throne during court, a silent, black-clad shadow. Her presence alone was a statement. The pack members, from high-ranking betas to scheming courtiers, would glance at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of confusion, disdain, and a healthy dose of fear. A wolfless omega, elevated to the highest station. It was an insult to their rigid hierarchy, and they didn't know what to make of her. Ravenna didn't care for their opinions. She watched. She listened. She learned the currents of power that flowed through the court, the whispered alliances, the simmering rivalries. Her mind, honed by years of tracking prey and channeling rage into focus, catalogued every subtle expression, every nervous tick, every lie that passed for diplomacy. King Kalen was a constant, unnerving presence at her side. He was nothing like the alphas she had known. He was powerful, yes. His alpha aura was a palpable force that could bring lesser wolves to their knees, but he wielded it with restraint. He was firm but fair, his judgments rooted in law and reason. And he watched her. She felt his golden eyes on her constantly, not with the possessive hunger she dreaded, but with a quiet, intense curiosity. It was, in its own way, just as unsettling. He spoke to her in low tones during court, asking for her observations. "What do you make of Lord Valerius?" he'd murmur, as the slick, silver-haired beta presented a petition. "He's lying," she would reply, her voice barely a breath. "His pulse is elevated and he keeps touching his neck. He's hiding something about his grain shipments." Kalen would simply nod, his expression unchanging, but later, his royal guards would be dispatched to inspect the Valerius granaries, where they would inevitably find a hidden cache of smuggled weapons. He came to trust her instincts implicitly. It was a strange, new feeling to have her judgment valued, her words given weight. It was also terrifying. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of trade disputes, Kalen found her in the royal library. She was running her fingers over the spines of old books, the scent of paper and ink a small comfort. "You are restless," he stated, his voice startling her. He had moved as silently as she did. She turned, schooling her features into their usual impassive mask. "The court is loud." "It is a nest of vipers," he agreed, stopping a few feet from her. He was dressed down from his royal attire, in a simple tunic and trousers, and without the trappings of his station, he seemed both more approachable and more dangerous. His scent filled the space between them, pine and winter air and something uniquely his, a scent of pure, undiluted alpha. It no longer triggered the panic it once would have. Instead, her body reacted with a confusing sense of calm. "You handle them well." "I observe them as I would any potential threat," she said. A training session had gone awry earlier that day. A brutish guard captain, offended by her position, had challenged her to a spar that was a thinly veiled attempt to humiliate her. She had accepted. He had come at her with brute force, confident in his size and strength. She had waited until he overcommitted, tossed a handful of silver powder she kept in her belt directly into his eyes, and as he roared and clawed at his face, she'd swept his legs with a low kick, using a wire she'd strung between his ankles moments before in the shuffle. The massive alpha crashed to the ground, and before he could recover, she dislocated his shoulder with a precise strike the monks had drilled into her 10,000 times. It was over before he understood he'd been fighting something that didn't fight with honor. Kaelin had been watching from the gallery. Now he stepped closer, his gaze dropping to her hand. "You were injured." She instinctively tried to pull her hand back, but he was too quick. He gently took her wrist, his touch surprisingly soft. A long, shallow cut ran across her knuckles, a souvenir from the captain's gauntlet catching her when she'd struck. It was already healing, but the skin was red and inflamed. "It is nothing." His thumb brushed over the cut, and a strange warmth spread up her arm, chasing away the ache. His touch was firm, but not confining. It was a gesture of care, not control. The distinction was so foreign to her that her breath hitched. For a terrifying moment, she felt the walls around her heart tremble. She saw a flicker of gold in his eyes, a sign of his wolf rising to the surface, and she pulled her hand back, her composure fracturing. "I am fine, Your Majesty." Kaelin let her go, his expression softening with an emotion she couldn't name. It looked like understanding. "My name is Kaelin," he said quietly. "In this library, when no one else is near, I am Kaelin." Ravenna stared at him, her mind racing. This was a line she could not cross. Familiarity was a weakness. Vulnerability was a death sentence. She had survived by being the detached enforcer Ashford. Ravenna was a ghost, a collection of scars and memories she kept locked away. "Thank you for the consideration, Your Majesty," she said, her voice stiff with formality. "But I believe a professional distance is for the best." A flicker of disappointment crossed his face, but he masked it with a nod. "As you wish, enforcer." He turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back at her over his shoulder, "I am glad you are here. The quiet is less empty with you in it." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the cavernous library with the scent of pine in the air and a warmth spreading from her hand all the way to the frozen-over landscape of her heart. The cage was starting to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. The illusion of safety, fragile as it was, shattered a month into her tenure as the king's hand. It came in the form of a sealed report, delivered by a grim-faced scout from the Southern Territories. Kaelin was in a meeting with his war council, discussing border disputes with the Black Moon Pack. Ravenna stood at her customary place by his side, a silent observer, when the messenger was shown in. The man was trembling, his face pale with horror. "Your Majesty," he stammered, kneeling and offering the scroll. "We found a holding camp, near the Shadowfen Pass, rogues it seems. They were trafficking omegas." A cold dread, sharp and familiar, pierced through Ravenna's carefully constructed armor. The council room erupted in outrage, the Beta Lords growling, their fists slamming on the great oak table. Kaelin's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. His alpha presence flooded the room, silencing the chaos with its sheer, suffocating weight. "Details," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The scout swallowed hard. They were well organized, cages, branding irons. It was a sophisticated operation. We engaged them, but they were prepared and well armed. We were driven back, but not before we identified 3 of their leaders. Kaelin took the scroll, his knuckles white as he broke the seal. He read the names aloud, his voice dripping with venom. Alpha Marcus Thorne, Alpha Lucian Vane, and Alpha Darius Blackwood. The world tilted. The air rushed from Ravenna's lungs, and the sounds of the council room faded into a deafening roar in her ears. Marcus, Lucian, Darius. Her three. The architects of her 5 years of hell. The names were brands on her soul, seared into her memory. Marcus, the brute, who believed his strength gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. Lucian, the manipulator, whose cruelest wounds were inflicted with words and mind games. And Darius, the leader, the sadist, who orchestrated their torment with chilling, detached pleasure. They were supposed to be gone, faded into obscurity, cast out from their former packs after she had escaped. But they were here, in his kingdom, doing to others what they had done to her. A wave of nausea and pure, unadulterated rage washed over her. Her vision swam, the edges turning dark. She felt a tremor run through her hand, and she clenched it into a fist, her nails digging into her palm, the pain a welcome anchor in the storm that was ripping her apart from the inside. The cold fire she'd spent 5 years stoking roared to life, threatening to consume her. Kaelin's head snapped up, his golden eyes instantly finding hers. The fury in his expression was immediately replaced by a sharp, piercing concern. He saw it. He saw the crack in her armor, the raw agony she was so desperate to hide. He knew. "Ravenna?" he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. The use of her first name was a shock that cut through the haze. He had respected her boundaries, always calling her enforcer. But now, seeing her distress, he broke his own rule. The Beta Lords and council members stopped their own blustering, their attention drawn to the silent, charged exchange between their king and his enforcer. They saw her pallor, the slight, almost imperceptible trembling of her body. They saw the king's focus shift entirely from the threat to his kingdom to the state of the woman at his side. "I know these names," she said, and the voice that came out was not her own. It was a raw, broken thing, dredged up from a place of deep trauma. It was the voice of the girl she had been. She cleared her throat, forcing the ice back into her veins, shoving the screaming memories back into their box. The rage steadied her, gave her focus. "I will handle this," she said, her voice leveling out, becoming the cold, precise instrument he was used to. "This is a matter for the king's hand." Lord Valerius, the same man she had identified as a smuggler, scoffed. "This is a military operation, not a task for a tracker. We should send a legion." "No," Ravenna said, her gray eyes locking with the Lord's. The coldness in her gaze was so absolute, so profound, that Valerius physically recoiled. "You will send me. I know how they think. I know how they operate. And I know their weaknesses. I will dismantle them from the inside out." Kaelin studied her, his expression a complex mixture of concern, dawning comprehension, and a deep, simmering rage on her behalf. He understood now. The shadows in her eyes, the walls around her heart, the reason a woman with her spirit was wolfless, it all started to click into a horrifying picture. These weren't just names on a report to her. They were her ghosts. They were the reason she'd spent 5 years learning to kill. "Enforcer Ashford is correct," Kaelin announced, his voice ringing with an authority that permitted no argument. "This mission requires precision, not just force. She will lead the operation." A murmur of protest started to rise, but Kaelin silenced it with a single sharp glare. "However," he continued, his golden eyes finding Ravenna's again, "she will not go alone. I will be accompanying her." This time, the shock in the room was absolute. The king himself, going into the field on a rogue hunting mission? It was unprecedented. "Your Majesty, that is unwise," his chief beta, a grizzled old wolf named Alistair, protested. "Your place is here." "My place is where justice is served," Kaelin roared, rising to his full height. His power slammed into them, a physical blow that made the very stones seem to vibrate. "These degenerates are operating in my lands, under my watch. Their crimes are an insult to me personally. I will see them brought to heel myself. Prepare a small elite unit. We ride at first light. Enforcer, a word. He strode from the room without a backward glance, the silent command for her to follow clear. Ravenna moved, her legs feeling stiff and disconnected from her body. She followed him into his private antechamber. He closed the door, and the silence was heavy. "They were your alphas," he said, not a question, but a statement of terrible fact. Ravenna's throat closed. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. Then the words came, raw and broken. "They held me for 5 years in a compound in the disputed borderlands. Marcus used his fists, his strength. He believed his size gave him the right to take whatever he wanted from me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And he took everything." Kalen's hands clenched into fists, his wolf snarling beneath his skin, but he remained silent, letting her speak. "Lucian used his words. He was the one who convinced me I deserved it, that I was worthless, that no one would ever come for me because I wasn't worth saving. He broke my mind while Marcus broke my body." She drew a shuddering breath. And Darius orchestrated it all. He was the calm one, the intelligent one. He studied me like an experiment, finding new ways to break me, rebuild me just enough to break me again. He violated every boundary that existed and made sure I knew that this was my life now. Forever. "How did you escape?" Kalen's voice was barely controlled fury. "I stopped begging. I stopped crying. I waited until Marcus was drunk and arrogant, until he thought I was too broken to fight back. And then I fought back with everything I had left." Her hands trembled with the memory. "I clawed his eyes, shattered a bottle across his skull, and ran. He came after me and we fought at the edge of a ravine. When I fell, taking him with me, I landed in the river. He landed on the rocks." She met Kalen's eyes. "I crawled out of that water more dead than alive. I heard them searching for my body for days while I hid in a cave, bleeding and broken. They gave up, assumed I'd drowned or been taken by animals. And I let them believe it while I learned to become something they would fear." Kalen crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, not asking permission, simply offering shelter. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," he said against her hair, "and they will pay for every moment of suffering they caused you." She stood rigid in his embrace for a moment, then slowly, tentatively, her arms came up around him. For just a few heartbeats, she allowed herself to be held, to be protected. Then she pulled back, her walls rebuilding. "This is not a choice for me," she said, her voice steadying. "It is a reckoning. I have trained for this. Every single day for 5 years." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not pity, but a profound and terrible respect. He nodded slowly. "Then we will deliver that reckoning together." The journey south was a tense, quiet affair. Kalen had chosen only 4 of his most trusted royal guard to accompany them, wolves who were disciplined and loyal to a fault. They rode hard, the rhythmic beat of hooves against the packed earth a constant drum marking the passage of time. For Ravenna, every beat was a step closer to a past she had spent 5 years trying to outrun, and 5 years preparing to confront. She rode slightly ahead of the others, a solitary figure in black, her focus on the path ahead, her senses straining for any sign of ambush. But her mind was a battlefield. Memories, ugly and sharp, clawed at the edges of her control. Marcus's heavy hand, Lucian's sly, cutting words, Darius's cold, analytical cruelty. She felt the phantom ache of old bruises, the ghost of shackles on her wrists. But beneath the pain, the rage burned steady and hot. It was fuel. It was purpose. Kalen kept a respectful distance, but she felt his presence like a physical weight at her back. It was not an oppressive weight, but a steadying one, a shield. He had not questioned her, had not pushed for the horrifying details he was surely imagining. He simply rode with her, his golden eyes often fixed on her, a silent promise of support. On the second evening, they made camp in a dense copse of pine trees. The guards set up a perimeter while Ravenna sat by the fire, sharpening a set of throwing knives with methodical, precise strokes. The repetitive scrape of steel on stone was a meditation, a way to focus her roiling thoughts. Each stroke was a memory transformed into readiness. Kaelin came to sit across from her, handing her a water skin and a piece of dried meat. She took them with a quiet nod of thanks. "You should eat," he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow comforting against the chirping of crickets. She took a small bite of the meat, chewing mechanically, the food tasteless in her mouth. "We should be near the Shadowfen Pass by midday tomorrow," she said, her voice all business. "The scouts' report said the camp was in the foothills. They'll have lookouts posted. We'll need to leave the horses and proceed on foot." "I'll leave the tactical approach to you," he replied, watching the firelight dance in her stormy gray eyes. "But the confrontation? You will not face them alone." "That is how I work," she countered, not looking up from her knife. "I am faster, quieter on my own." "Not this time, Ravenna." His voice was soft, but laced with the unyielding steel of his alpha command. It wasn't a suggestion. "My wolf, it will not allow it. I will be with you." She looked up then, her eyes clashing with his. The firelight carved his face in lines of shadow and gold, and the intensity in his gaze stole her breath. It was fiercely protective, a raw, primal emotion that went beyond his duty as her king. It was personal. She saw his wolf looking at her through his eyes, a powerful, ancient creature that had laid some silent, inexplicable claim on her. It should have terrified her. Instead, a strange, traitorous part of her felt safe. Her own inner strength, the part of her she sometimes thought of as her own dormant wolf, the core of fury and resilience that had kept her alive, seemed to answer his. Not with submission, but with a flicker of recognition. "Where did you learn to fight the way you do?" he asked quietly, shifting the subject but not the intimacy of the moment. Ravenna was silent for a long moment, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. "After I escaped, I tried to disappear, live quietly in a human village. I thought if I made myself small enough, invisible enough, I'd be safe." She stared into the flames. "Then I heard Marcus's name. He'd moved to a new territory, taken a new Omega. I realized they were still out there, still hunting, and I was hiding." "What changed?" Kaelin asked softly. "I did. I found a monastery in the northern wastes. The monks there had been attacked by rogues 20 years prior. The survivors had spent 2 decades developing ways for humans to kill shifters. Not just survive, kill." Her voice was distant, seeing another time. "I begged them to train me. They refused, said I was too angry, that rage makes you reckless. So I stayed anyway. For 3 months I worked their fields, hauled their water, chopped their wood. Every night I practiced in secret, mimicking the moves I'd seen them teach others." She flexed her scarred knuckles. "Finally, Brother Aldrich caught me destroying a training dummy at midnight. My hands were bloody, my knuckles broken from punching wood. He asked me why. I told him, because my anger is all I have. Teach me to wield it, or I'll die trying to avenge myself anyway." She smiled without humor. He said, "If you're going to die anyway, you might as well die dangerous." So he taught me, for 2 years every single day, how to turn rage into precision, how to channel pain into focus, how to make every strike count because I'd only get one chance against an opponent stronger and faster than me. Kaelin watched her with profound respect. "And the other 3 years?" "I hunted small prey first, lone rogues, deserters, built my reputation, learned to use poisons, to set traps, to strike from shadows. I wasn't fighting for justice then. I was practicing. Every capture was me imagining their faces, training myself to be efficient enough, cold enough, deadly enough to face them when the time came." She looked at him directly. "I've been preparing for this hunt for 5 years. This is my reckoning." Kaelin was silent, absorbing this. He saw her differently now, not as broken but as reforged, tempered in fire into something extraordinary. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. A ghost of vulnerability crossed her face before she locked it down again. "I'm a survivor, that's all." Later that night, sleep refused to come. She lay wrapped in her bedroll, staring up at the canopy of stars, her mind replaying 1,000 moments of degradation. A nightmare began to coil around her, suffocating and real. She was back in Darius's compound, the air thick with the scent of stale wine and his cloying cologne. He was smiling that terrible, calm smile as he held a silver chain. She gasped, a choked, desperate sound, her body jerking as she fought her way out of the dream's grip. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. A shadow fell over her. She flinched, her hand instinctively going for the knife under her pillow. "It's only me." Kalen's voice was a low whisper in the darkness. He was crouched a few feet away, a dark, powerful silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He hadn't touched her, hadn't moved closer. He was just there. A solid, grounding presence in the terrifying darkness of her mind. "A bad dream," she managed to say, her voice hoarse. "I know," he said softly. He didn't offer empty platitudes or ask what it was about. He simply sat with her in the oppressive silence, his presence a bulwark against the encroaching shadows. After a long moment, he spoke again. "When I was a boy, my father, the king, was a hard man. He believed fear was the only tool for shaping a strong alpha. When my wolf first emerged, it was a painful, violent transformation. I was terrified of the beast inside me. I had nightmares for a year." Ravenna turned her head, looking at him. It was the first time he had ever shared anything personal, a piece of his own vulnerability. It was a gift, an offering of trust. "What did you do?" she whispered. "My mother," he said, a note of old grief in his voice, "would sit with me. She wouldn't say anything. She would just be there, a quiet presence in the room until the fear passed. She used to say that some monsters cannot be fought, they can only be outlasted. And it's easier to outlast them when you're not alone." He remained there for what felt like an hour, an unmoving sentinel. He didn't speak again, he didn't need to. Gradually, the frantic pounding of Ravenna's heart slowed. The chill of the nightmare receded, replaced by a tentative, fragile warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time, she felt the truth of his mother's words. She was not alone in the darkness. When she finally drifted back to sleep, it was dreamless, and the king of all wolves stood guard over her soul. They found the tracks the next afternoon. Broken branches, churned mud, and the faint, foul scent of too many unwashed bodies. Ravenna dismounted, examining the signs with a practiced eye. "At least 30 wolves," she murmured, Kalen at her side. "Well armed. They're not just rogues, they're organized. A small army." "An army built on suffering," Kalen growled, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. His rage was a cold, controlled thing, far more dangerous than any hot-tempered outburst. "They're camped in a box canyon about 2 miles ahead. There's only one way in or out, but the canyon walls are riddled with caves. It's a natural fortress," Ravenna explained, pointing to a crude map she'd drawn in the dirt. "They'll have sentries on the ridges. A frontal assault would be costly and alert them to destroy evidence or kill prisoners." "What do you suggest, Enforcer?" he asked, his use of her title a sign that they were back to business. He deferred to her expertise without hesitation, an act that earned him a grudging respect from Ravenna and a surprised look from his guards. "You and your men will create a diversion at the canyon mouth, a lot of noise. Make them think a full legion is at their door. They'll pull all their forces to the entrance to defend it." "And you?" Kalen asked, his eyes narrowing. "While they're distracted, I'll scale the western cliff face. There's a fissure that runs to the top, hidden by a waterfall. It will be difficult and slick, but it should be unguarded. I'll get inside the camp, locate the prisoners, and secure them. Once they are safe, I will signal you with this." She held up the silver pendant he'd given her. It was a daring, dangerous plan. Kalen's wolf bristled at the idea of her going in alone, of her taking such a risk. But the human part of him, the king who trusted her instincts and her training, knew it was their best chance. "Agreed," he said, his voice tight. "But if you are compromised, if anything goes wrong, you press that beacon immediately. Do you understand? I will come for you." She looked at the pendant in her palm. It was still warm from her skin. "I understand. Let's move." The diversion worked perfectly. The sounds of a skirmish, clanging steel, furious howls, and the commanding shouts of Kalen's guards echoed up the canyon. As the camp's forces scrambled toward the entrance, Ravenna began her ascent. The cliff was treacherous, slick with spray from the waterfall, the handholds uncertain. It was a grueling, punishing climb, but she moved with a climber's grace born of desperation and training, her focus absolute. Every handhold was a choice to keep going. Every upward pull was a rejection of the helpless girl she'd been. Near the top, she slipped. Her boot lost its purchase on a patch of wet moss, and for one heart-stopping second, she was dangling by her fingertips, the jagged rocks hundreds of feet below. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to seize her. The old fear, the voice that said she was weak, that she would fail. But she fought it back with the fire she'd cultivated. Not today, not ever again. She found a new foothold, tested it, and hauled herself up over the ledge, collapsing onto the rock, her lungs burning. She allowed herself 3 breaths, then pushed herself up and crept toward the edge of the camp. The scene below was one of controlled chaos. Most of the rogues were at the far end, forming a defensive line against Kalen's assault. But a few remained, including one she recognized instantly, even from a distance, even after 5 years. Marcus Thorne. He was even bigger than she remembered, a mountain of muscle and greasy hair. He was bellowing orders, his face red with exertion. He was directing 2 other wolves to check the cages set back against the canyon wall. Ravenna's blood ran cold when she saw them. There were at least a dozen omegas, mostly young women and a few men, huddled together in a large iron cage, their eyes wide with terror. One of them, a slender girl with dark hair, looked heartbreakingly familiar. No, it couldn't be. But as Ravenna's eyes focused, her heart stopped. Ilara. Her younger sister. The sister she hadn't seen in 5 years. The sister she thought was dead or lost forever. Darius had kept her, hidden her, his special prize. The cold, professional fury inside Ravenna shattered completely, replaced by a blazing, white-hot inferno of pure, protective rage. This was no longer just a reckoning. It was a rescue. She found her target, Marcus. He was the brute, the simplest of the 3 to understand. He responded to strength and dominance. She would give him an overdose of both. She moved through the shadows of the camp, a wraith in the chaos. She picked up a heavy iron crowbar left near a smoldering fire. Marcus had his back to her, still shouting at his men. She fed every memory of his cruelty into the cold fire of her focus. Every time he'd laughed at her pain. Every time he'd told her she was nothing. She didn't announce herself. She didn't give him the satisfaction of a challenge or a fair fight. The monks had taught her that honor was a luxury the weak couldn't afford. She swung the crowbar in a vicious arc, striking him squarely behind the knees with all the force of 5 years of hate. His legs buckled with a sickening crack of shattering bone, and the massive alpha crashed to the ground with a scream of agony and surprise. He twisted, his eyes bulging as he saw her standing over him. For a moment, there was only confusion on his face. He saw a female, an omega by her scent, clad in black. Then, his eyes focused on her face, on the old, faded scar that ran from her temple to her jaw, a gift he'd given her one night years ago when she tried to fight back. Recognition dawned, followed by utter, abject disbelief and terror. "You?" he choked out, his voice a strangled whisper. "Raven?" But you're dead. You have to be dead. I survived, she said, her voice a blade of ice and fire. A fact I'm sure you regret. Panic flooded his features, replacing the arrogance. He was crippled, helpless. The power dynamic had been violently, irrevocably reversed. Raven, wait, he pleaded, trying to drag himself backward with his hands, his broken legs useless. It wasn't me. It was Darius. He made me. I never wanted to hurt you. Please. The lies were pathetic. She remembered him laughing as he'd chained her. She remembered him telling her she existed for his pleasure. She remembered every single moment. She didn't just want to stop him. Part of her, the part forged in rage, wanted him to suffer as she had suffered. You begged me to stop, she said, her voice dangerously quiet, each word measured. Every day, I begged. Do you remember what you gave me? Tears of pain and terror streamed down his face. Mercy, he whimpered. Please, Raven, have mercy. Ravenna looked down at the broken monster at her feet. She felt the rage demanding release, demanding blood. It would be so easy, so satisfying. But she also felt something else, the weight of Kaelin's respect, the memory of the monks teaching her control, the knowledge that she was no longer that helpless girl. She had a choice. I remember every time I begged you, she said, her voice steady despite the inferno inside. You gave me nothing. She raised the crowbar and Marcus flinched, sobbing. She brought it down with brutal precision on his right shoulder, shattering it, then his left. She disarmed him, broke him, left him howling in agony on the floor of the camp he once commanded. But she didn't kill him. She chose justice over murder. Her hands were shaking violently now, not with fear, but with the effort of restraint. She wanted to keep going, wanted to hear him scream until his voice broke. The rage was a living thing inside her, demanding more. But she turned her back on his screams and walked toward the cages, her hands shaking not with fear, but with the effort of stopping. The hard part wasn't the violence. It was knowing when to stop. And she'd finally learned. The 2 guards Marcus had been ordering turned from the cage, their weapons raised, drawn by his screams. They saw Ravenna, saw the crowbar she'd dropped, and their alpha writhing on the ground and charged with furious howls. Ravenna let the heavy iron bar fall. It was too slow, too clumsy for this kind of fight. She met their attack with the fluid, brutal grace the monks had drilled into her. She ducked under the wild swing of the first guard, her hand darting out to snatch the dagger from his belt. She spun, using his own momentum to throw him off balance, and drove her elbow into the back of his neck, sending him sprawling, dazed. The second guard was more cautious. He circled her, a long knife held expertly in his hand. He was faster than Marcus, more skilled, a trained warrior. The boss is going to enjoy tearing you apart for that, little Omega, he snarled. Ravenna didn't reply. She held the stolen dagger in a reverse grip, her body coiled like a spring, her breathing controlled. She let the rage simmer beneath the surface, channeled into cold precision. He lunged. The fight was a blur of motion. He was stronger, but she was quicker and infinitely more precise. She didn't fight his strength, she redirected it. Every lunge, every slash, she met not with a block, but with a parry that twisted his arm, broke his balance, and created an opening. She was a phantom, always just beyond the reach of his blade, while her own dagger licked out, leaving shallow, stinging cuts on his arms and ribs. Pain to weaken, distraction to create opportunity. He grew frustrated, his attacks becoming sloppier, angrier. Predictable. That was the opening she'd been waiting for. He overcommitted on a downward slash, and she moved inside his guard, her free hand slapping his knife arm aside. In the same motion, she brought the pommel of her dagger up in a brutal strike under his chin, a move she'd practiced 10,000 times on training dummies while imagining faces she hated. His head snapped back, his eyes rolled up, and he collapsed in an unconscious heap. It was over. The entire confrontation had taken less than a minute. She stood for a second, her chest heaving, the adrenaline singing in her veins, her knuckles bleeding from where his armor had scraped her. Then she turned her attention to the real prize, the cage. The Omegas inside were staring at her, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. They had just watched a lone Omega, no bigger than any of them, systematically dismantle 3 large, armed alphas. Ravenna walked to the cage door. It was secured with a heavy iron lock. "Stand back," she said, her voice gentle, a tone she hadn't used in years, a tone she'd almost forgotten she possessed. She took the guard's discarded knife and wedged the tip into the lock mechanism. It was a crude lock, designed to keep frightened Omegas in, not to withstand determined lockpicking. With a sharp twist and a grunt of effort, the mechanism snapped. The door creaked open. The Omegas didn't move. They were conditioned by fear, trained to believe freedom was a trick, that hope was a lie. Ravenna understood. She had been there. She dropped the knife and held up her empty hands, making herself as non-threatening as possible. "My name is Ravenna," she said softly, meeting their eyes. "I am the king's hand. I am here to get you out. You are safe now." A young woman with wide, terrified eyes, who couldn't have been more than 16, whispered, "They'll kill us for this." "No," Ravenna said, her voice hardening with conviction and controlled fury. "They won't. Their rule is over." And then she saw her. At the back of the cage, Ilara. Older, thinner, her dark hair matted, her clothes torn, but alive. Their eyes met, and Ilara's face crumpled with disbelief and desperate hope. "Raven?" she whispered, the childhood nickname a sob. "Ilara," Ravenna breathed, her composure shattering. She reached into the cage, and her sister stumbled forward, throwing her arms around Ravenna's neck. Ravenna held her tight, burying her face in Ilara's hair, the cold walls around her heart dissolving into dust. She was not the king's hand. She was not the enforcer. She was just a sister, holding the only family she had left, and for a moment, the rage gave way to overwhelming relief and love. She reached into her tunic and took out the silver pendant Kaelin had given her. She pressed the center stone. It was time. Kaelin felt the pulse against his skin, a faint, rhythmic warmth from the beacon. It was her signal. The prisoners were secure. "Now!" he roared to his men. The diversionary fight ceased. The real assault began. Kaelin shifted. The change was a whirlwind of cracking bone and stretching sinew, his human form exploding into that of a massive wolf. His fur was the color of midnight, his eyes burning gold. He was twice the size of a normal wolf, a creature of myth and power. His guards shifted with him, and the 5 wolves surged into the canyon, a tide of vengeful fury. The rogues at the canyon mouth, already disorganized and demoralized, broke in terror at the sight of the giant Alpha King leading the charge. The fight was brutal and short. Kaelin was a force of nature, his jaws snapping, his claws tearing through the pathetic defenses of the traffickers. He was driven by a cold, protective rage, the image of Ravenna walking into this den of monsters alone, the knowledge of what these creatures had done to her and others, fueling his every move. He reached the main camp to a scene of carnage. His 4 guards were finishing off the last of the resistance. He saw the unconscious forms of 2 guards near the opened cage and the broken, weeping form of a large alpha he assumed was Marcus Thorne, the first name on Ravenna's list of ghosts. And he saw Ravenna. She was standing with the freed Omegas, her arms wrapped around a younger woman who looked remarkably like her, holding her as if she'd never let go. She was unharmed, but he could scent the adrenaline and exhaustion and profound emotion coming off her in waves. Her gray eyes met his across the chaos-strewn clearing. The relief that flooded him was so powerful it almost forced him back into his human form immediately. His wolf wanted to run to her, to nudge her with his muzzle, to cover her in his scent and declare her safe and his. He held the instinct in check, forcing himself to focus on securing the scene. He shifted back, the transformation rolling over him in a shimmering wave. He stood, and one of his guards quickly brought him a cloak to wrap around himself. "Is this all of them?" he asked Ravenna, his voice still rough with the remnants of his wolf's fury. "All the prisoners, yes," she confirmed, her voice thick with emotion but steady. "But only one of the leaders. Lucian and Darius are not here." Before she could say more, one of the captured rogues, pinned under the boot of a royal guard, began to laugh, a gurgling, bloody sound. "You're too late, Your Majesty," the man spat, blood on his teeth. "Darius took the special prize, the pureblood. He's headed for the coast. By the time you find him, he'll have sold her to the highest bidder across the sea." Kaelin's eyes narrowed dangerously. "What pureblood? We have the prisoners." The man grinned maliciously. "Not all of them. The one with the silver eyes. The one Darius said was worth more than all the others combined. He left 3 days ago." Kaelin's head snapped toward Ravenna. Her blood had run cold. She released Alara, stepping forward, her face a mask of ice and barely restrained fury. "This girl," Ravenna said, her voice deadly calm, pulling Alara forward gently. "Dark hair. My sister. She has gray eyes, not silver. Who else did he take?" The rogue's grin widened, enjoying the twist of the knife. "Another one, younger. Looked like this one, but different. Silver eyes. Said she was rare bloodline. Darius's personal project." Ravenna's world tilted again. There had been another girl. In the chaos of the rescue, she'd been so focused on Alara. But there had been whispers, rumors in her captivity, of another Omega Darius kept separate, hidden. A girl he called his masterpiece. "How long ago did he leave?" Kaelin demanded, his alpha command making the rogue flinch. 3 days. He's headed to Shadow Cove. There's a ship waiting." Ravenna looked at Kaelin, and he saw in her eyes not just the hunter, but the protector. "We go now," she said. It was not a request. Kaelin nodded. He detailed 2 of his guards to escort the freed Omegas, including Alara, and the prisoners, including the bound and broken Marcus, back to the capital under heavy guard. He, Ravenna, and his 2 best trackers would ride on immediately. There was no time to waste. This hunt wasn't over. And Ravenna's rage, her need to save the innocent from the monster who'd tormented her, burned hotter than ever. The pursuit was relentless. They rode through the night, changing horses at a royal outpost, pushing themselves and their mounts to the limit. Ravenna was a woman possessed, her focus absolute, her fury a cold, steady flame. Every mile closer to Darius was a mile closer to ending this. On the 2nd day, fortune smiled on them. They found the 2nd alpha, Lucian Vane, at a roadside inn. It was a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. Ravenna spotted his horse, a distinctive gray stallion, tied outside a raucous tavern. While Kaelin and his guards secured the perimeter quietly, Ravenna went inside alone. She needed this. The tavern was filled with rough-looking travelers and locals. Lucian was sitting at a corner table, a tankard of ale in his hand, laughing with 2 other men. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a slick way, charming, with intelligent eyes that hid a serpent's soul. He was the manipulator, the one who had enjoyed breaking her spirit more than her body, the one who'd whispered that she was worthless until she almost believed it. She walked directly to his table, her steps deliberate. He looked up, a friendly, practiced smile on his face that faltered as he saw her. He didn't recognize her at first. He just saw a determined woman in black leathers, someone official. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk, the voice that had cut her to pieces. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Ravenna said, her voice low and even, the rage simmering beneath. Lucian's brow furrowed in confusion. Then his eyes drifted to the scar on her face, the one Marcus had given her but Lucian had mocked, and his smile vanished. A flicker of recognition, then shock, then a carefully masked fear appeared in his eyes. He recovered quickly, his charming facade snapping back into place like a mask. "I'm afraid you have me mistaken for someone else, miss," he said smoothly, starting to rise. "No," Ravenna said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word a dagger. "I don't. I remember everything, Lucian. I remember the lessons in the study. I remember you telling me I was worthless, that no one would ever want me, that I deserved everything that happened to me. I remember you smiling while I cried. I remember every single word." The two men at the table with him looked back and forth between them, their expressions confused and uneasy. Lucian's face had gone pale, the confident mask slipping. "This is absurd," he blustered, trying to project an aura of offended dignity. "I have no idea what this madwoman is talking about. I've never seen her before in my life." "Don't you?" Ravenna took a step closer and he flinched. "You always thought you were the smartest. You thought your words were more powerful than Marcus's fists or Darius's cruelty. But your words were just another kind of cage, Lucian. And I've broken out of all of them. You told me I'd always be alone. You were wrong." He tried to push past her, panic starting to override his cunning, but a large hand clamped down on his shoulder from behind. Kalen stood there, a figure of implacable authority, his golden eyes burning with cold fire. Lucian froze, all the color draining from his face, as he recognized the royal crest on Kalen's armor, the king himself. "Alpha Lucian Vane," Kalen said, his voice a low growl of judgment that filled the suddenly silent tavern. "You are under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking, and treason against the crown." Lucian's sophisticated mask crumbled completely, revealing the sniveling coward beneath. His eyes went wild with panic. "It was Darius!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "It was all his idea. I was a victim just like her. He forced me into it. I never wanted any of this." Ravenna looked at the man who had psychologically tormented her for years, who had tried to convince her she was broken beyond repair, now reduced to a pathetic, groveling mess, blaming others, begging for mercy he'd never shown. She felt a flicker of grim satisfaction, but also a strange emptiness. His power over her was gone. He was nothing. "Take him away," Kalen commanded his guards. As they dragged him out, Lucian's desperate eyes found Ravenna's. "Tell them, Raven," he pleaded, his voice breaking. "Tell them I was kind to you sometimes. Tell them I tried to protect you from the others. Please." Ravenna simply watched him go, her expression unreadable. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. His lies didn't deserve a response. After he was gone, the tavern slowly returned to its normal buzz, patrons deliberately looking away, wanting no part of royal business. Kalen turned to her, his expression full of concern. He gently placed a hand on her arm. "Are you all right?" She looked at his hand, then up at his face. His concern was genuine, a warm light in the cold darkness of her confrontation. For a moment, she wanted to collapse into him, to let him carry the weight. But there was still one ghost left. In the carriage back to the outpost where they'd change horses, Ravenna stared at her hands. They were trembling. Not from fear, from the effort it had taken not to kill Lucian in that tavern, in front of everyone. She'd wanted to make him suffer the way he'd made her suffer. "Are you afraid of me now?" she asked, not looking at Kalen. "No. I wanted to kill him. I wanted to hurt him slowly, methodically, the way he hurt me. I wanted to prove that his words didn't break me by breaking him with my hands." Her voice cracked. "What kind of person does that make me?" "A survivor," Kalen said firmly. She finally looked at him, her eyes burning with unshed tears and barely restrained rage. "That doesn't frighten you? That your mate is capable of such violence, such cruelty?" "My mate," he interrupted, his golden eyes fierce and unwavering, "is capable of incredible strength. Your anger is proof you survived. It's proof they didn't break you. It's proof that despite everything they did, you're still fighting." He reached across the space between them and took her shaking hands in his. "I am not frightened by your fire, Ravenna. I am in awe of it." "What if I can't control it?" The question was barely a whisper, her deepest fear laid bare. "What if the rage is all I am, all I have left?" He squeezed her hands, his touch grounding and warm. "Then I will help you carry it. But I will never ask you to extinguish it. Your rage is righteous. It's yours. Own it. And when it threatens to consume you, I will be the one to remind you who you are beyond it." She stared at him, this powerful alpha king who could command armies, who could crush her with one hand, offering not to fix her, but to stand beside her in her darkness. "You really see me," she breathed, her voice breaking. "I see all of you," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "The rage and the sorrow, the strength and the fear, the hunter and the woman who's learning she doesn't have to choose between being fierce and being loved. And I choose all of it, all of you." For the first time, Ravenna allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be both. The reckoning wasn't complete, but when it was, when the last ghost was laid to rest, perhaps she could finally believe she deserved the home he was offering. The cove was a desolate place, a jagged scar on the coastline shrouded in a perpetual gray mist. The smell of salt, rotting kelp, and fear hung heavy in the air. A single, dilapidated shack stood near the water's edge, and a small, sea-worn ship was anchored just offshore, rocking gently in the swell. This was the end of the line. They left the horses hidden in the sparse, twisted trees that clung to the cliffs, and approached on foot, moving like shadows. The air was heavy, oppressive. 2 guards were posted outside the shack, sloppy and overconfident. Kalen and his men dispatched them with silent, brutal efficiency. The king himself moved with the deadly grace of a predator, his fury now honed to a fine, lethal point. He nodded to Ravenna. It was time. Ravenna kicked the door in. It flew from its hinges and crashed to the floor with a splintering crack. Inside, the scene was exactly as she had feared and expected. A young woman, barely 16, with dark hair and startling silver eyes, was bound to a chair in the center of the room, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling. And standing behind her, a long, silver knife, held to her throat with practiced ease, was Darius Blackwood. He was just as she remembered, every detail seared into her memory. Impeccably dressed even in this hovel, his clothes fine and clean, his dark hair slicked back, and those cold, intelligent eyes that held a terrifying, analytical calm. He was not a brute like Marcus or a coward like Lucian. He was a monster who enjoyed his own monstrosity with an artist's detachment. He smiled when he saw Ravenna, and it was a slow, cruel curving of his lips, the smile of a man who believed he was still in control. "Ravenna," he said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that made her skin crawl. "I knew you'd come. I have been waiting for this reunion. You've become quite the legend, haven't you? The king's hand. How deliciously ironic." "Let her go, Darius," Ravenna said, and her voice shook, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it felt like it would tear her apart from the inside. Every fiber of her being screamed for his blood. The girl in the chair whimpered, her silver eyes wide with terror, looking between Ravenna and the monster holding her. "Sister?" the girl whispered, confused, desperate. "No, child," Darius said softly, almost gently, to his captive. "She's not your sister. But she is the reason you're so valuable. A matched set, you see. 2 rare, wolfless omegas from similar bloodlines. You were going to make me a fortune." He looked back at Ravenna, his eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "Though I must admit, seeing what you've become is far more entertaining than any profit." Kalen and his guards moved to flank Ravenna, their swords drawn, their faces grim masks of controlled fury. Darius's smile widened as he took in the Alpha King, showing no fear, only a cold, calculated assessment. "And you brought the king himself. How flattering." "But you see, Your Majesty," he said, his tone mocking, "you are at a disadvantage. One move, 1 inch closer, and the girl dies. Her blood will be on your hands." "You will not leave this cove alive, Blackwood," Kalen growled, his voice vibrating with barely leashed power, his wolf snarling just beneath the surface. "Perhaps," Darius conceded with a slight shrug, utterly unbothered. "But I will not die alone. And before I do, I think I'll enjoy watching Ravenna's face as I take this one from her, just like I took everything else." He shifted his gaze back to Ravenna, and his expression turned cruelly intimate. "This is a fascinating turn of events, isn't it, my dear? My broken little Omega returned as the king's pet? Did you tell him what you are, Ravenna? Did you tell him how you begged, how you wept, how utterly pathetic you were?" Every word was a poisoned dart, aimed at the old wounds he himself had carved into her soul, designed to make her react, to make her lose control. She could feel the rage boiling, threatening to explode into reckless action. But then she looked at the girl in the chair. She saw the terror in those silver eyes, but she also saw a flicker of defiance, a spark of the same stubborn resilience that had kept her own spirit alive through 5 years of hell. She had to be smart. She had to be controlled. For this girl, for all of them. Ravenna took a deep breath, feeding the rage into the cold fire of focus the monks had taught her. "Your words don't work on me anymore, Darius," she said, her voice steady, cold as winter steel. "You have nothing left. No power, no leverage, just a knife and a hostage, and that makes you exactly what you've always been. A coward." "I have your sister!" he hissed, pressing the blade harder against the girl's skin. A thin line of red welled up, and the girl whimpered in pain. "She's not my sister. She's an innocent you're using because you know you can't beat me any other way." A low, guttural snarl ripped from Kalen's chest, his control fracturing. His wolf was fighting for dominance, the urge to tear Darius limb from limb nearly overwhelming him. His eyes blazed gold. Ravenna put a hand on Kalen's arm, a small gesture that was both a restraint and a plea. "Trust me." She took a step forward, and Darius's eyes narrowed. "You are a coward, Darius," she repeated, her voice low and relentless. "You hide behind hostages and fear because you are nothing without them. You always were. You needed Marcus's strength and Lucian's manipulation because you yourself are weak. A pathetic, hollow man who could only feel powerful by destroying those weaker than you." She kept talking, her voice a relentless tide against the shores of his sanity. She recounted his crimes, his pathetic need for control, his deep-seated fear of being seen as weak and insignificant. She dismantled him, piece by piece, with the truth, her words as sharp as any blade. She could see him starting to unravel. His calm was cracking, his grip on the knife tightening until his knuckles were white, his eyes darting between her, the king, and the door. He was a cornered rat, and cornered rats were dangerous. But they were also predictable. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice rising, losing its cultured edge. "You think becoming his enforcer makes you strong? You're still just a broken Omega playing dress-up. I made you. I forged you in fire." "No," Ravenna said, and her voice was quiet but filled with absolute certainty. "You tried to burn me to ash. You failed. I'm the woman who survived you, and that makes me stronger than you will ever be." And then he made his mistake. He glanced over his shoulder for a fraction of a second, looking toward the ship anchored offshore, his only escape, his mind already calculating. In that instant, the girl, the one with the silver eyes and the spark of defiance, acted. With a surge of desperate, reckless courage, she slammed her head backward, striking Darius hard under the chin. It wasn't a powerful blow, she was small and bound, but it was unexpected. His head snapped back with a crack, his teeth clicking together violently. His grip on the knife loosened for a heartbeat. It was all Ravenna needed. She had already been moving, a coiled spring released. She crossed the remaining distance in a blur, her hand snatching his knife wrist with a grip like iron, twisting it with brutal, bone-snapping force. The silver blade clattered to the floor. Darius opened his mouth to scream, to call for help, but Kalen and his guards were already there, crashing into the room like a tidal wave. Ravenna didn't let go. She drove her palm into Darius's face, shattering his nose with a sickening crunch. Blood exploded across his face, across her hand. As he staggered back, dazed and bleeding, she swept his legs out from under him, and he crashed to the floor hard, his head striking the wood with a dull thud. The king's guards were on him in an instant, pinning him down, binding his hands with iron shackles. It was over. Darius Blackwood, the architect of her torment, the monster who had haunted her nightmares for 5 years, lay broken and subdued at her feet. Ravenna stood over him, her chest heaving, her hands shaking with the effort of not killing him. It would be so easy. One strike to his throat, one twist of his neck, he was helpless, hers. The rage screamed for it, demanded it, howled for the satisfaction of ending him. But she turned away. She rushed to the girl in the chair, her hands fumbling with the ropes, forcing herself to focus on saving rather than destroying. The moment the girl was free, Ravenna pulled her into a protective embrace, shielding her from the sight of Darius. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I've got you. You're safe." The girl clung to her, sobbing. Across the room, Kalen watched, his heart aching with a fierce, protective love. He saw Ravenna not as his weapon, not as his enforcer, but as the incredible, resilient, powerful woman she was, his queen. Darius, pinned to the floor, his face a bloody mask, looked up at Ravenna. He saw the tears on her face as she comforted the girl, the softness in her embrace. He saw vulnerability, and even in his defeat, he tried to wield it as a weapon. "Look at you," he rasped, a broken laugh in his voice, blood bubbling on his lips. "Still just a weak, sentimental Omega. You can't even finish what you started. I made you a killer, and you're too pathetic to kill." Ravenna looked up from the girl's embrace, her gray eyes meeting his. The coldness was back, but it was different now. It was not the emptiness of a survivor numbing herself to endure. It was the chilling certainty of a judge who had weighed the scales and found him wanting. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the small, squalid room. "You're wrong, Darius. My feelings don't make me weak. They make me strong enough to choose. Strong enough to let justice, not vengeance, decide your fate." She stood, keeping the girl behind her protectively, and looked at Kalen. Her gaze was unwavering, filled with a quiet strength that took his breath away. "He is yours, Your Majesty. Let the law decide his fate. Let him rot in a cell, powerless and forgotten, knowing that the Omega he tried to break is the one who brought him down." Kalen nodded, his respect for her deepening into something far beyond admiration, something that felt like reverence. "It will be done." And in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty. His love for her was not just his own selfish desire, it was the will of fate, the call of the bond that connected their very souls. She was his other half, the steel to his strength, the mercy to his judgment, the heart he'd been missing his entire life. The return to the capital was a world away from the tense, desperate journey south. The girl with the silver eyes, whose name was Lyra, rode with them, safe and slowly beginning to heal under the watchful care of Kalen's guards. Alara, reunited with Ravenna at the capital, was there to greet them when they arrived, and the two sisters held each other for a long time, a tangle of relief and tears and whispered promises to never be separated again. Ravenna had saved them both. The trial was swift and decisive. The testimony of dozens of freed Omegas, combined with the confessions extracted from Lucian and Marcus, and the irrefutable evidence found at the camps painted a damning picture of systematic abuse and trafficking. Darius Blackwood, arrogant and unrepentant to the last, refused to speak in his own defense, his silence a final act of contempt. He was sentenced, along with Marcus Thorne and Lucian Vane, to life in the Black Cells, the kingdom's most secure and desolate prison, a place of eternal darkness and isolation deep beneath the mountains. It was a fate many considered worse than death. Justice had been served. That evening, after delivering Marcus to the cells earlier in the week, Ravenna had returned to her quarters. The trial was over. The hunt was complete. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow. She closed the door to her chambers, her hands steady, her face calm, her breathing controlled. Then she saw her reflection in the mirror. The scream that tore from her throat was 5 years old, ripped from a place so deep she'd thought it was buried forever. She grabbed the water pitcher and hurled it. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting a fractured version of herself. Not enough. It wasn't enough. She overturned the table, the crash satisfying and terrible, ripped the bedding until feathers floated through the air like snow, kicked the delicate chair until it splintered into kindling. Her knuckles split open as she punched the stone wall, again and again, the pain grounding and freeing all at once. She didn't hear the door open, didn't hear Kaelin enter. She was too far gone, lost in the catharsis of destruction, sobbing and screaming and breaking everything she could reach. The rage that had sustained her for 5 years had nowhere left to go, and it was tearing her apart from the inside. Kaelin didn't try to stop her, didn't try to calm her or tell her it was okay or that she should control herself. He simply moved the sharp objects out of her reach, then sat on the floor amid the wreckage and waited. When Ravenna finally collapsed, her chest heaving with sobs that sounded like growls, surrounded by destruction, her hands bleeding, he was still there, just sitting, watching, present. "I wanted to kill him," she finally gasped, her voice raw, broken. "I wanted it so badly I could taste it. And the worst part, the part that terrifies me, is that I would have enjoyed it. I would have smiled while he screamed. What does that make me?" "Human," Kaelin said quietly. "It makes you human. And it makes you someone who has every right to that rage." "But I'm afraid," she whispered, looking at her bleeding hands, at the destruction she'd caused, at the evidence of the violence she was capable of. "I'm afraid that the anger is all I have left, that without it, I'll just be broken again, that I'm nothing without the hate." Kaelin reached across the space between them, his palm up, an offering, not a demand. "The anger is not all you have, not anymore." She looked at his hand, then at his face, saw nothing but acceptance, no fear of her violence, no judgment of her rage, no disgust at her weakness, just presence, steadiness, home. Slowly, her hand trembling, she placed her bleeding palm in his. He closed his fingers gently around hers, careful of her wounds. "You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to want vengeance. You are allowed to struggle with choosing mercy. That doesn't make you a monster. It makes you someone who survived monsters and chose not to become one." "How do you know I won't become like them?" The question was her deepest terror, the fear that kept her awake at night. "Because you're asking the question," he said simply, his golden eyes holding hers. "Because you chose to let him live, even though every part of you wanted him dead. Because you're sitting here, afraid of your own capacity for violence, instead of reveling in it. That's the difference between you and them, Ravenna. They enjoyed the cruelty. You're haunted by even contemplating it." Ravenna's tears came then, not the violent sobs of before, but quiet, exhausted weeping. The release of years of holding everything in, of being strong, of never letting anyone see her break. Kaelin pulled her into his arms, and she let him, too tired to maintain her walls, too raw to pretend she was strong enough to carry this alone. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair, his arms a fortress around her shaking frame. And I'm not letting go. Ever. For the first time since her captivity began all those years ago, Ravenna believed that maybe someone actually wouldn't. That maybe she'd finally found someone who could see her darkness and not turn away. That maybe, just maybe, she was allowed to be both fierce and fragile, strong and scared, a warrior and a woman who needed to be held. As the sun set over the capital that final evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ravenna stood on the balcony of her chambers, looking out over the city lights. She felt lighter, as if a weight she'd carried for 5 years had finally been lifted. The rage was still there, she knew. It would always be there, a part of her as much as her scars. But it no longer defined her. It was a tool, a strength, but it was balanced now by something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Hope. A quiet knock came at her door. She knew who it was. "Come in," she said softly. Kalen entered, closing the door behind him. He didn't wear his crown or his formal attire. He was just Kalen, his golden eyes soft in the fading light, his expression open and vulnerable, in a way he only ever was with her. He walked to stand beside her on the balcony, their shoulders almost touching, and for a long time they were silent, simply sharing the quiet moment, the peace that came after the storm. "Elara and Lyra are settling in well," he said finally, his voice low and warm. "The royal healers say they are strong, traumatized, but resilient. They have the same fire you do. They'll heal." "Thank you," Ravenna said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. "For everything. For trusting me. For coming with me. For not asking me to be anything other than what I am. For believing I was strong enough to face them." "There was never a choice," he replied, turning to face her fully. He gently took her hands in his, and his touch was warm and grounding, an anchor in a world that had tried to set her adrift. "My wolf recognized you from the first moment we met, Ravenna. It saw the strength and fire you tried so hard to hide. It saw its mate." His words hung in the air, a beautiful, terrifying truth. He wasn't proclaiming ownership. He was stating a fact, a deep, undeniable connection that had been humming between them from the very beginning, growing stronger with every shared moment, every battle fought side by side, every vulnerability offered and accepted. "You are my mate," he said again, his voice a low, devoted murmur, his eyes searching hers. "My other half, the queen my heart and my kingdom have been waiting for." He looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable, his alpha authority completely softened by his love for her. He was the most powerful wolf in the world, and he was offering her his heart, his life, his throne. He was not commanding her. He was asking, hoping. "I am not asking you to forget your past," he continued, his thumbs stroking the backs of her hands, a soothing rhythm, "or to pretend the scars don't exist. I am asking you to build a future with me, a future where you are not defined by what they did to you, but by who you choose to be. And I want to be by your side for all of it, if you'll have me." Ravenna looked into his golden eyes and saw her future. A future not of mere survival, but of life. A future with love, with family, with a purpose that came not from vengeance or rage, but from a desire to protect and build something better. She thought of the broken Omega she had been, cowering in the darkness, begging for mercy that never came, believing she was worthless and alone. She thought of the cold, detached hunter she had become, hiding in the shadows, using rage as armor, convinced she could never be anything but a weapon. And she looked at the man who had seen all of her, the broken pieces and the sharp edges, the fury and the fear, the capacity for both violence and tenderness, and had not tried to fix her, or tame her, or diminish her, but had simply stood beside her, offering his strength, respecting her choices, and loving her for exactly who she was. "My whole life," she began, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of emotion, Alphas have tried to cage me, to own me, to break me. They saw an omega and thought I was a thing to be possessed, to be used, to be discarded when they were done. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and certain, no longer hiding behind walls of ice. You are the first to see me as a person, the first to see me as an equal, the first to accept my anger, my darkness, my scars, and not ask me to extinguish any of it. She squeezed his hands, a small, sure gesture, an anchor in the overwhelming tide of feeling. My inner wolf, the part of me I thought was dead or never existed, the core of who I am beneath all the trauma, it recognized you too, Kaylin. From that very first day in the throne room, it recognized its home. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, a smile of such profound joy and relief that it transformed his kingly, often stern features into something breathtakingly warm and human and vulnerable. He lifted one of her hands and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles, his lips warm against her scarred skin, against the evidence of every fight she'd survived. "I choose you, Ravenna Ashford," he declared softly, his voice full of devotion and promise and unwavering certainty. "Before the moon and the stars, before my kingdom and my crown, I choose you. Not as my enforcer, not as my weapon, but as my mate, my queen, my equal, my home." "And I choose you, Kaylin Voss," she whispered back, the words feeling like the most natural, truest thing she had ever spoken, a vow more binding than any chain, more powerful than any magic. "I choose to build a future, not hide from the past. I choose love, not just survival. I choose vulnerability, not just strength. I choose you." He pulled her gently into his arms, and she went without hesitation, without fear, without the walls that had protected her for so long. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her not with the possessive grip of ownership, but with the cherishing embrace of a man holding his entire world. The missing piece of his soul finally returned to him. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady, strong beat of his heart, a rhythm that matched her own, that called to something deep inside her that had been silent for too long. His scent of pine and winter air and something uniquely his enveloped her, a scent of safety and belonging and home. He was merciless to those who threatened his people, a king of iron and law and unyielding justice. But with her, he was vulnerable, devoted, gentle, and endlessly patient. She, in turn, was still the hunter, the enforcer who would show no mercy to those who preyed on the weak and innocent. Her rage was not gone, it would never be gone, and she didn't want it to be. It was simply no longer all she had. It was a tool, a strength, forged in fire and honed by years of discipline. But it was balanced now, by love, by hope, by the knowledge that she was more than her trauma, more than her anger, more than the weapon she'd made herself into. In his arms, she could finally be Ravenna, a woman who had not only survived her past, but had conquered it, who had turned her pain into power and her fury into justice, who had learned that choosing mercy didn't make her weak, and that accepting love didn't make her vulnerable. It made her complete. Together, they were more than just a king and his enforcer. They were a king and his queen, two halves of a single, powerful soul, forged in fire and tempered by trials, ready to build a future defined not by the scars of their past, but by the unbreakable strength of their love and their shared commitment to protect those who could not protect themselves. The huntress had found her home. The lonely king had found his heart. And in the gathering darkness, as the first stars began to appear in the sky above the capital, two souls who had been broken and lost finally found their way to being whole.